Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's program is part of the 2020 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme Beyond Borders and the book Exit West by Mohsen Hamid. For more information on other virtual programs, including book discussions, author events, workshops, and more, visit onebookonechicago.org. Thanks to the Chicago Public Library Foundation, Bank of America, Union Pacific, and United Airlines for their support in making this season of One Book, One Chicago possible. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience for our Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask one. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Hoda Katebi and Abigail Glaum-Lathbury for a conversation about fashion, politics, and human rights presented as part of Slow Fashion Month. Hoda is a Chicago-based Iranian-American writer, organizer, and creative educator, focused on the intersections of fashion, resistance, gender, and the state. She is the host of the #BecauseWeRead, a radical digital book club and discussion series with over 20 chapters globally. A founding member of Blue Tin Production, an apparel manufacturing workers cooperative run by working class women of color. A national lead with Believers Bail Out, a bail fund using Zakat to bail Muslims from pretrial and immigration incarceration, and an organizer with the No War campaign. She's the author of the book Tehran Streetstyle, available at the Chicago Public Library, and her writing has appeared in publications including Newsweek, Washington Post, and the Columbia Journalism Review. Hoda will be interviewed by Abigail Glaum-Lathbury. Abigail is a Chicago-based artist and designer. In 2014, she co-founded the Rational Dress Society, a collective that raises questions around identity and consumption through a radical approach to inclusive sizing. Her work has been shown at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Nevada Museum of Art, Art in General, and the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts in New York, among many others. She is an assistant professor of fashion design at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. Again, following the presentation, we'll have a chance to ask our guests questions, so please feel free to leave your questions in the chat, which we'll be monitoring. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Hoda and Abigail.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having us. So I guess I want to start with, it's nice to see you, Hoda. So good to see you. So I just wanted to just mention that Hoda and I have a long working relationship and also a friendship. So I'm hoping that this conversation will be fairly casual. Both of us have quite a lot of experience in a handful of things, and I'm going to try to avoid talk about lingo. Specifically, we're going to be talking quite a lot about manufacturing. And manufacturing processes. So I'm hopefully we'll be able to frame questions just to give a little bit of context, but if something doesn't make sense or seems a little bit unclear, please do put that into the chat. I'm more than happy to clarify, and I know what it is as well. So I want to ask you two things. We're going to start with you as a human. And then we'll move a little bit into talking specifically about Blue Tin Cooperative. So I will start with you. So you have quite an interest in street style. And I'm wondering, as we mentioned, right, your book is available at the library. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your background, like where it is that you became interested in fashion and what particularly is interesting to you about fashion, because I do think it's a bit different than many people might expect.
Thank you. It's so good to see you, as always. You look fabulous. I love your earrings. And also, thank you so much to the Chicago Public Libraries for having us. Really grateful to be here and share space with Abigail. Abigail's also brilliant, so yeah, excited. Yeah, fashion's a fun thing. I think for me, fashion has always been very inherently political. It's not, I was never really into fashion growing up. I was never one to like play dress up as a kid. And I have no background in it whatsoever. And so I would have never imagined that, like, lo and behold, now I'm working at a manufacturing company and talking about different size needles. But for me, as someone who was actually born and raised in Oklahoma, and in a very white, very conservative, and very racist like upbringing, I realized the moment that I started wearing my hijab in 6th grade that the way that you dress is very powerful. And I wouldn't have gotten punched in the face, for example, in 6th grade at age 11 if I was wearing a scarf around my neck instead of around my head. The ways in which I presented my body in public spaces really framed the ways in which people engage with me, the violence I received by my classmates, but also by the state. And also just seeing the ways in which fashion is actually used so much in so many political contexts, both with an individual sort of relationship with each other, but then also when we look at the media, when we look at the news, the ways in which the hijab or ways that specific people dress, particularly Muslims and people of color, are either like used, exploited, or really used as justification for violence. And we see this so much. So for example, like I think growing up, my mom picked my clothes for much of my life. But then I started to really realize, and like, especially when I came to Chicago in 2012, and I realized that it was not normal to be called a terrorist when you go grocery shopping. I was like, oh my God, this is a wild, wild experience. And for me, I started to really think about the ways in which we present our bodies in public spaces through clothes, the way that we're communicating different things about ourselves, and the world that we occupy through our clothes. I think it's so deeply powerful and so deeply and inherently political. So for example, like the ways that I, obviously every time I get dressed and leave my house, I recognize that wearing a hijab in the United States, or right now, I think there's a lot of conversations happening in France about hijabs and Muslim and violence against Muslims because of hijabs. It's something that I recognize that I'm probably going to receive some form of violence or another walking in the street. And that's not something that I have to think, like, I shouldn't have to think about just by the way that I dress, but it's also not just Muslims, right? I think that a lot of women also, when they are leaving their house at certain times of night, unfortunately have to think about how they dress because of the ways that it's going to be used against them later if violence happens to them. Or for example, here in Chicago, the south side of Chicago, a Black man wearing certain colors would get automatically added to a gang database because of racist policing and things like that. So I think so many people have to think about the ways that they dress every single day, every time they step outside of their homes. And I know many people don't. And I think that oftentimes we think that our like choices or these actions are not political and that, oh, we're just wearing cute clothes and we're just walking out of our house. But it's important to recognize that everything that we do and everything that we wear is inherently political. And so if you don't have to think about the way that you dress whenever you step outside of your home, that's not an apolitical decision. You're not like outside of politics. That's a reflection of your privilege of being able to not have to think about how you dress yourself when you leave the house. That's still deeply political. And so when I really started to think about these things very deeply when I came to Chicago is also, I mean, the same time that I discovered fashion blogs for the first time. It was just like, oh my God, people literally just post pictures of themselves on the internet and like run with it, and they just hashtag outfit of the day, and this is like a thing. And so it was like a fun little like creative outlet that I started to kind of understand also the aesthetic power of things, the beauty of fashion, and the value of it on a very like tangential level of both, yes, the politics of how we're framing our bodies, but also how our clothes are made. The fact that the majority of our clothes are made in the global South, and yet the majority of it is consumed here in the West. The amount of clothes that we buy each day, the fact that I'm sure 90, 95, 99% of everybody watching this right now has no idea where their clothes were made, let alone the people's hands that went into making that clothes. And so I think that when we really take a step back and think about our fashion and the ways that we dress ourselves here in the United States and the ways in which fashion is used globally, I think it's deeply powerful and deeply political. And I think we don't get to see that a lot because of the ways in which we live in a patriarchal, sexist world that doesn't value women's work and things that, and because women dominate the industry, both in terms of people who are making clothes, people who are consuming it, we see that it's shallow or like silly and surface level. But when we really are able to step back, we realize how deeply intelligent, how deeply incredibly powerful that fashion really is. So that's how I got into it.
Just in brief. Amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, I feel like a lot of we talk in fashion a lot about the aesthetics of things and how things are looking, and how maybe one puts something together, right? But we're often not talking about the way that things are made, and specifically who it is that makes them. And you and I have talked quite a lot about fast fashion, and for I think I'm happy to say that I think the dialogue or the sort of awareness of conversations around fast fashion have changed pretty dramatically over the last handful of years. But in case anybody's not sure what is fast fashion, these are clothes that are produced for companies like Target, Zara, H&M, Forever 21, and these clothes can go from conception. So I am a designer and maybe I have an idea for a trench coat, for example. It could go from the pen or probably Wacom tablet, since we're in the year 2020, to store racks in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. And so we're really looking at like a very rapid set of production cycles. And so I think that's something that we don't think about often, right? We go to a store and we see all these clothes out, they're available to us, and they're very cheap, and they're like, frequently very beautiful. And so I'm interested. I know we can have that discussion too. but I'm wondering, like that's sort of the visible side of it, and I think a lot of what you're interested in is kind of the intersection of the visible and also particularly the invisible, which brings us to Blue Tin production, which is a workers cooperative. And so I'm wondering if we could actually just start with like the very, very origins, sort of maybe start with what is Blue Tin in the words, and then how did it start, and specifically where does the name come from?
Great question. I keep doing this and I keep forgetting to bring one home, but it's the circle Danish Blue Tin cookie containers that either you, your mother, your grandmother, or your immigrant neighbor's mother has stored her sewing kit in, and it is not cookies. And the first time I actually had the Danish cookie was when we bought them at our studio, and we're like, this is the cookies that are inside. I always am used to the needles. And so it's really the namesake is very much paying homage to the fact that this idea of immigrants, refugees, and women of color making clothes is not new in the slightest, in organizing themselves. It is something that our mothers, our grandparents, our ancestors have been doing for decades and decades and generations. And so the namesake is really paying homage to the fact that our people have always been doing this and doing it amazingly, and not forced to always work in these like stuffy factories and sweatshops that have these like massive disparities in terms of like wages and hierarchy. But so Blue Tin essentially is an all women immigrant, refugee, and working class women of color apparel manufacturing workers cooperative. I need to find a faster way to describe that, I swear. But we essentially we're a manufacturing company. So we are the place that clothes get cut and sewn. We are the phase between the fabric being made and then being shipped to designers that then get either straight to the store racks or online sales, so wherever. So we're a B2B, so we're a business to business company. So we don't sell anything to consumers. And I always think that it's wild, and I feel like I always have to describe this, but humans make clothes. So I just want to be very clear about that right now. Machines don't make clothes. And I'm sorry if anyone told you that growing up, they lied to you. And Santa Claus, we'll leave that one for later. But machines do not make your clothes. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that people are making clothes. So the price racks, the price tags that you're seeing, this has gone through like so many hands, not just one pair of hands, but like literally maybe 10, 20, 30 people have been in the process, or more minimum, have been in the process of all of the steps of how like a $5 t-shirt is made. And so we do production for designers here in Chicago, as well as nationally and a few internationally. And we're a workers cooperative, which means that everybody who is a part of the business also owns the business, and decisions are made collectively, and also all the profits are shared collectively. So there's not a manager who makes higher amounts of profits than everybody else. There's not somebody who isn't doing the work that's telling everybody else how to do the work. And it's like inherent in this is a very like beautiful sense of community. And so one thing that we're really trying to address, or two things actually, is one is just a lack of ethical and sustainable production alternatives for designers in the United States especially. And the fashion industry is one of the most destructive industries in the world. The carbon dioxide, right? It's one of the dioxides. I'm pretty sure it's carbon dioxide, is more than maritime shipping and airlines combined. Is that?
Yeah, I mean the statistics that I always hear, which is always like slightly complicated to parse out, just because of how many different processes there are. But frequently, and it is sometimes disputed, fashion is talked about as being the second dirtiest industry after coal. Just to put things into perspective.
Yeah, I usually like to put it at least in the second or third, because the U.S. military is actually the most environmentally destructive organization in the world, given all of the bombs that it drops in environment that creates. But aside from that, fashion is very up high there. And yeah, and I think that that's something that's really, really important to recognize, is that one thing about living in this country is that we do not see the majority of the violence that goes into making our clothes. And by violence, I mean not only wage theft, not only the ways in like sweatshop conditions, gender-based violence, sexual violence that happens, but also the waterways that are polluted, a complete deforestation of countries. And so a lot of that actually does happen in the United States. LA and New York have massive sweatshop rings that are being closed down left and right and then jumping back up. So this is not something that's not happening at all in the United States, but I think it's hiding in very, very intentionally ways that are hidden from the public. So we've set up very intentional like degrees of separation between the people who are buying the clothes, so all of us, and then the people who are making the clothes. And this is something for us that's so important to be able to break down, is letting people know that A, people make your clothes, and B, that we are the people, not me, I don't know how to sew, but the rest of the team is the people that are making your clothes. And so we're really trying to fill the gap within the United States of ethical and sustainable manufacturing, apparel manufacturing. So in order to do that, we've really tried to turn the entire fast fashion industry, or the fashion industry, on its head. So we recognize a lot of the different ways in which fashion is harming people and the planet. And so we're really trying to fit in there and not say, oh, we're trying to reform this or pay people a little bit better or make the hours a little bit less, but we are calling for the abolition of fast fashion. And because we do not believe that fast fashion can be reformed, and we do not believe that fast fashion can be made better, because fast fashion requires and depends on violence in order to be created. And Abigail mentioned a little bit about why that is that just the mass amounts of output that is required by a lot of these companies, which is why Forever 21 or whatever fast fashion brand have like 10 million new styles added daily. The reason is that there are actually people who are making those clothes at literally robotic speeds, speeds that are non-humanly possible. And so for people to be forced to make clothes that fast, there has to be violence that happens in order for people to work faster, for people to be able to create those outputs, for people to be able to work 18, 19, 20 hours a day sometimes, not see their children, not be able to even go home, and not get paid overtime. And if we want to talk about looting, I know everyone's talking about looting these days, so much wage looting is happening when companies like Nike, the owner of which is some of these richest people on earth, own these massive brands, and yet garment workers are rarely paid, and if so, are paid very sweatshop level rates. And so there's so much violence that happens, and a lot of this is gendered too. We see the majority of garment workers are women, particularly women of color, and particularly Muslim women of color, and a lot of managers are men and strategically positioned as men so that gender-based violence can be used in order to make people work faster. And so because of the way that fast fashion is structured and organized, there's no way that clothes can be made this fast for this cheap that does not harm humans and the earth. And so we're not trying to reform that, we're trying to abolish that. And so just like, policing or prisons or other things that are inherently violent and can't be reformed, we understand that we're not trying to make violence a little bit less, we're trying to get rid of violence. And so within our abolitionist vision, we are calling for an end to fast fashion, and also abolition is just as much the imagination and envisionment of a world that you want to live in. And so the hardest part, but the most exciting part about Blue Tin is that we are literally getting to imagine and build the world that we want to live in. And that means, like, ultimately we all have to wear clothes. So what does it mean in order to make clothes that make us all happy? How can we make clothes in a way that allows our families and our people not only to just survive or get by, but thrive? You know, we have such low standards for what it means to be able to have a decent job, especially for immigrants, refugees, and working class women of color. But what does it mean to actually create a workplace that we can all thrive in and get enough income to do things that, like, it means to live, be able to have, like, lives, and not just live to work? And how can we also create systems and a workplace that is not rooted in capitalism, rooted in this idea that we need to make profit for somebody who is not even part of the company, who just, like, sits and gives orders top down, but instead creating a space that values humans, that values the people who are making those clothes, and creating an environment that, like, is rooted in love and compassion and, like, community building. And so it's a really, really incredibly beautiful space, because we are literally all we need. And so we're part of an ecosystem, of course, of, like, amazing abolitionist work in Chicago. And we also are really building a lot of what it means to create an abolitionist vision within the fashion industry as well. So a lot of the ways in which we operate, we're not trying to fit in and do what is the status quo, but reimagining and building what we want and what we need. So, for example, another way in which a lot of violence is able to happen is that within supply chains, there's a huge distance between the people, like the designers, the brands, like the Nikes, the H&Ms, and then the garment workers. And so there'll be a subcontractor, so they'll hire somebody else, and then they'll hire 3 or more people. And so there's, like, contractors and subcontractors that are really, really separate the brands and the companies with the people who are making their clothes. So then when violence happens on these production floors, when massive fires happen, I think many of us remember the Rana Plaza factory collapse, massive catastrophes happening on production floors, like waterways being destroyed, forests. Brands like H&M or Nike or Gap can literally clean their hands of it, because they're like, I don't know where we're producing our stuff, and I don't care, because I don't want to have to deal with that. And so for us, we refuse to work with contractors and subcontractors, and we request and require that designers work with us directly, and have a direct line of communication. And that's really, really important for us, because we need them to know who's making their clothes, and we need to know who we're dealing with. And so for us, a lot of the ways that we are really trying to operate is redrawing those rules on our terms based on what we want and what we need to be able to live the lives that we want. And I think that's really, really important for us. And the second thing that we're really trying to address is a lot of the ways in which, I mentioned this a little bit, but, like, the lack of economic mobility options for women of color, specifically in Chicago. We see massive segregation in Chicago that also intersects with massive disinvestment by our mayor, and investment. The only investment that we see in communities, specifically on the South Side and West Side, are weapons. So we see a $95 million police academy trying to be built in West Garfield Park, where they closed down 6 schools because of a lack of funding. So what does it mean that we see all of our communities, and communities of color particularly, getting all of the schools closed down, all of the jobs being moved away, and yet the only money that's coming in is militarism, is police, is weapons? And so for us, it's really important that we're creating spaces of care and safety outside of that, but also at the same time allowing people to grow and build things on their own terms, and get income that makes sense for them. And I think that's something that we also see a great extent of an issue within the refugee resettlement world as well too. We see a lot of refugee resettlement agencies, unfortunately, drenched in white saviorism. This idea that, like, refugees need saving, and, like, they're so cute, and oh my God, my clothes are made by refugees. So it's, like, a really problematic also way that we really infantilize refugees in this country. We kind of look down. There's a lot of this idea that they should be grateful that they're here, and, like, we're just opening our hearts, and we're so like wonderful, and America is a beacon of greatness because we're letting refugees come in. Besides the fact that America has created most of these refugees, let's be very clear about that. And in fact, letting them into this country is an obligation of the United States because of what it's done to destroy these homelands. But aside from that, these people are incredible. Whether or not, like, and I hate this idea that, oh, because they can like get things done, or like because they're like good at the economy and they'll help build no, because they're humans and they deserve to have amazing lives too. So we also don't think that getting somebody a job at McDonald's checks the box for refugee resettlement. And the bar is so low for people who have experienced violence and trauma because, oh, you know, at least they have a job, or at least this. And we say no, we reject that notion. We think that every person should have the ability to live the life that they want in a space that gives them care and love and compassion. And so we don't follow minimum wage, we don't follow living wage in Chicago. We've instead set collectively internal thriving wages that allows everybody the income that they need, not only to like get by, but to live their lives, and providing everything that they need in order to be able to make that job happen. So on-site interpreters, childcare, translators, what are typically seen as barriers for work, but like really honing in and like making sure that those people who otherwise may have not the ability to get well-paid work, everything that they need so that they can also like live the lives that they want, because you cannot survive, especially with 4 kids as a widow, making less than minimum wage at McDonald's. I'm sorry. So those are the 2 things that we're addressing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what drew me immediately to Bhutan was that it's absolutely a holistic approach. I mean, I think a lot of the conversations that we have around reform sort of take a spirit of like incremental, like little by little change. You know, we'll do a little bit of change here, a little bit of change there. And I think a lot of times that has to do a bit with the language of like austerity. You know, like, oh, we just couldn't afford to do that. And what I really admire about what you do with Bhutan is that you're not operating from a position of lack, but instead a position of abundance, and to say yes, but why not, right? Like, why shouldn't we be able to take a weekend, for example? Whereas within the sort of normal manufacturing, if I could back up just for like a quick second, to talk about like as designers generally speaking, will approach a factory and say, especially in the case of like fast fashion, where you would have a particular price point that's already been set. And so like, I'm going to pick on anthropology for a second, because they always, why not? There's a pair of pants always costs this much money, and it doesn't matter who the designer is, that pair of pants is always costing that same amount of money. And that threshold is really actually set by the corporations. And so then all of the pressure to manufacture these garments is pushed downward. And Hoda, you mentioned that like our clothes aren't made by robots, which they're not. And I think it can be easy. I know, shocking. But I think it can be easy to think that they are made because they're so inexpensive. That when it's logical, it's illogical to my mind that you would go into a Forever 21 and think, oh, it's $1.90 for a tank top. There's no way that the materials had to have been grown, combed, spun, dyed, manufactured into a textile, then cut. The pattern has to be developed, then it has to be cut and stitched, finished, packaged, right, shipped, across the world here, and then there's still a profit for the corporation. So at $1.90, they're like Forever 21 is still making money, even with all of that other
rent for all their buildings, all of their staff.
Yeah, it goes on and on. And so I'm interested in a couple things. If you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned subcontractors, and I just want to be like, what does that look like? Because I think it's also like not so many people sew anymore, and it wasn't so long ago that people used to stitch quite a bit more, and so I think it can be a little confusing to kind of figure out like, well, what is happening here? So like when you look at a t-shirt, how many processes do you see? Like what?
This is an Abigail question.
I know. I'm sorry, Hannah. But I mean, just to like break it down, because I think like that's where you get into the subcontractors, is that there are a lot of steps to actually making something, and so as a follow-up, what is it? I know. What is it that Bhutan likes to make? Because I think that's another kind of inversion, where in a normal sort of in the normal or traditional or sort of it's not traditional because fast fashion is new, but within the recent historical sort of precedent, that there is like, the designer comes to the factory, they say it needs to be made at this much, we need it in this many weeks, can you do it? And the factories are frequently left with not a whole lot of options, and they say yes, and then you end up with a subcontractor chain. And so you, on the other hand, if a designer sends Blue Tin a box, like what happens? Like what does that look like? Because it's a very different negotiation.
The corner and forget it, but I'm kidding.
No, not true. I've opened some of those boxes, I know.
Yeah, also I want you to answer the question about the mechanics as both a designer and a professor, and also someone who has spent so much time at Blue Tin that we like all love you and like have made Blue Tin possible in so many ways. I'm gonna pass that question on to you. Throw that one back.
Well, so okay.
I'll answer the box question though.
Okay. Wait,
what?
Which part am I answering?
Oh, I can. The one like what happens when a designer sends you this stuff.
Yeah.
But I feel like you do such a better job of explaining.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. In trouble. So I'm supposed to be interviewing you.
But you're so much better at this.
No, don't say that. Don't say that. It's not true. It's not true. So the typical process is that like a designer will create something, and you make what's called a sample or a prototype, and then based on that you work with a factory. And so I might send a prototype to Blue Tin, for example.
Choice.
Excellent choice. The best. It's the only choice, really. And so then Blue Tin might open up that. Let's say it's I'm gonna go with a trench coat. We'll say. And so if you look at, or even better, actually, let's pick a pair of blue jeans. When you look at a pair of blue jeans, you think like they're so familiar to us, right? Like probably most of you are wearing them. They have 5 pockets, you're familiar with that, right? Like they might have a certain type of hem, but the number of different steps that go into making a pair of blue jeans is actually quite extensive. So there's somebody who has to cut them. And in industrial cutting, things get cut in layers. So you cut multiple ply. It's almost like if you were to take a box of Kleenex, right, with all of those different layers of Kleenex, like that's more or less what it looks like, except that instead of tissues, it's fabric. And then those go to all of the different operators who then stitch the different components. So you might have somebody who sews the fly, you might have somebody who sets the button, you might have somebody who sews the inseam. And so in a traditional sort of line factory, and you can think of this like a Ford assembly plant almost. We call it Fordian manufacturing for that reason. So there's one person who has a type of expertise. And so that's sort of like the traditional model. And you do that and to an extent, although at Blue Tin, what's I think really elegant and important to make a distinction here is that you're not working on a typical factory line. And so like if one of the members is working on a piece, like they might have a strength in something, but that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that they're ever doing. So could you maybe talk a little bit about like what that process looks like, just sort of manufacturing something, so taking a sample and then taking it from cutting all the way through to finished shipped garments?
I like how you gave half that answer back to me.
Really good. Come on.
That was great. I appreciate that you did that. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, and I think something that is also really fun and different about Blue Tin that we're also trying to challenge is that the people who are making the clothes decide what clothes get made and how it gets made as well too. And so I feel like I've gotten very good at reading everybody's eye rolls or like glares when a designer came in, unfortunately pre-COVID, and they would like pull out something that was just completely hideous, and the whole team would just kind of like have this certain look, and I'd be like, I don't think that we have time for this right now. And so it's really great because I think for me, I feel like cooperatives are just logical. Like I'm just very confused why the world is not structured in a way that the workers own the means of production. It's Marxist. And so I think what's really, really incredible though is that it makes sense, right? The people who are making the clothes should like what they're making and should know how to make it and feel good about what they're making. Like I don't like it's very basic and it feels very simple. And so it's been really great because every designer that we bring on as a client has been voted on and agreed on by every single member. And we take turns sort of also leading how production goes. So we have a rotating production lead depending on strengths and weaknesses again, that kind of sets up production and is like, okay, this is how we're gonna get this done. We're gonna get this much done today, and kind of sets our schedule. And it's not the same person every time. It's not someone who gets paid more. And because we're also all very much horizontally structured, we're able to really create a space that feels like there's so much like trust in each other. And we know each other like so well. We know exactly what people are good at. We know exactly how to make things happen really fast and efficiently. And in a way that also is not prioritizing just like these really strict deadlines and timelines. That also I think is a big issue that we're trying to challenge as well too. So a lot of the designers that we pick or agree to work with, I think we're people who recognize also the value of or the violence I think of fast fashion, which runs on 52 seasons a year. So that is one season every week. But really is understanding how to create clothes that lasts long and is not made to fall apart like fast fashion is. And the politics behind it, like who is this person designing? Do they have access to other production facilities? What bodies are they designing for? How are they sort of fitting or challenging gender norms? How can we really actually work with designers who share the same vision as we do? And so a lot of the people that we take on are really doing really incredible, amazing things. And it's really exciting to be able to work with people who are on the same page as us. And we're able to really build out this ecosystem on a place that does not sort of prioritize designers and their timelines and their needs and their price points, but in a way that's more collaborative. Because oftentimes, as Abigail mentioned, designers are used to just coming in, setting the prices, setting the timeline, and then you either make it happen. And a big practice that happens is that a lot of people will hire a bunch of garment workers to finish an order and then fire all of them at the end of it because they're like, we don't know what's happening next. And so it's unfortunately a very common practice and happened actually a lot right at the start of COVID, where all of these major companies had huge orders at production facilities worldwide, and after they were finished, refused to pay for them. And so not only have garment workers not been paid for 4 or 5 months, maybe a few years, at that point, there was no money to even pay them anymore at all. And so millions of garment workers around the world lost their job at the start of COVID. And we saw this in Los Angeles as well too. Like it's not just something that is happening abroad and over there. And even if it was, as like a side note, I think that's also, we're all inherently complicit in what's happening abroad because the United States is an active empire. Like the reason why sweatshops exist abroad is not because like people don't care about their own lives, and people just like expect less, but because there's history of imperialism, history of genocide, history of war. If we look at where a lot of these manufacturing companies are around the world, we see a history of US economic imperialism, a history where the United States has bombed, caused wars, flooded in military equipment. And so we have to understand also our responsibility and our sort of the way that we benefit from America's global empire, even if we're not even buying fast fashion. So we're still very much complicit in the fact that we can have the option to buy a $1 ugly t-shirt if we wanted to. I think that option is something that we have to recognize whether or not we take it. And so something that's been important for us also is to be able to really collapse those lines between designers and makers in a way that is anti-capitalist and anti sort of empire, and really trying to put us all on the same page in that sense. But to answer Abigail's actual question.
That was the answer, that was good.
After it comes to our studio and we agreed to like take on a client, we organize production internally, then we will ship it back to the designer. But we also, I think we're also trying to not just be like an ethical like space, because again, our work is very holistic. We understand that fashion is not like a thing that happens in isolation over here. It is very much connected to everything. I just mentioned militarism is connected to policing and jails. A lot of apparel is actually produced as a form of forced labor within jails. And that's something that we also have to talk about and reckon with, is that a lot of clothes are made within jails as well as police, military equipment. And so I think that's what is, yeah, I think that's really important, is that like like this is very much connected. So for us, having a workspace also means how are we dealing with sort of the implications of, or how can we use all of the ways that fashion is connected to everything as also a form of change. So within sustainability also, we have a lot of internal ways that we track waste. We're a completely zero plastic manufacturing facility, which is very, very challenging or hard to find within the fashion industry because everything is put in poly bags, which is that little bag that you get if you order something online. So we've been able to figure out alternatives to a lot of the ways that plastic is consumed. And also when you have a workers cooperative and it's mostly all women of color in charge, then you don't throw anything away. So because of that, our average waste is 9% of textile like waste, which is significantly lower than a global average, which is around 20% or so. And the sustainable fashion like manufacturing is about 10%. So we have just been 1% under the global standard for sustainable manufacturing. And that's literally was unintentional. Like it was not something that we set out to do, which has been fun because it's literally just like women who will not throw anything away. And sometimes we do get in fights about things because they find a way to repurpose everything, which is incredible. But that's also because and I think that's just like fascinating. And I think that's so emblematic of like what happens when women of color are in charge in a facility that is not capitalist. And it's not just like vacuous representation politics, but it's substantial. Their decision-making and our values are very much rooted in humans in the world. And so whenever women of color are in charge like this in a space like this, obviously we're going to be global standards for sustainability because they refuse to throw anything away, and that's just how we operate. And so we really also like work with designers within waste and like really try to be a very much collaborative way in that we operate both with designers, but then also with consumers and try to do a lot of education to, again, break down a lot of those barriers between the consumers that are buying the clothes from the designer and then also like our factory, our studio. So one thing that we're also we started our TikTok. We haven't uploaded any videos yet, but stay tuned because it's really important for us to be able to also like talk about how clothes are made for millennials, white people, and Gen Z, and all of the people who are wearing and buying clothes, which I'm assuming everyone who is watching this right now is wearing something. So therefore, this is about you. You're complicit. You sitting on your couch. And so I think that's really, really important for us also to like create a lot of educational materials and really break those barriers down between like what happens at a studio, what happens on their production floor, and why is it not happening like this anywhere else in the world?
Well, so speaking of it happening anywhere else in the world, you are the only production facility that I know of in the city of Chicago that is cooperative. But I think you are also moving towards thinking about Bhutan as both the discrete location within the city, but also as like a larger model. And I'm wondering if you could maybe just talk a little bit about that. Like what is the future of Bhutan? And then I know we have a little bit of time also for Q&A, so I don't want to only hog all of the time.
We could also talk like for a week straight.
We could.
Mostly because I just like love listening to you and learning from you. So I'll tell you afterward and just oh please. So yeah, I think what is really important for us is that we're not also trying to just like, again, fashion does not happen in isolation. Nothing happens in isolation. So for our goal is to really be able to build Bhutan out as a model that can be replicated on a global scale in a way that can also be customized and curated based on the people who are living in different places. We know that it's not one size fit all, nothing is, not even close. And Abigail has a lot to say about that, I'm sure. And so for us, like we really want to be able to encourage other worker cooperatives within the fashion manufacturing on a global scale to be able to also take what we've learned here and be able to apply it and replicate this. So we're in conversations with a few other cities around the world that we're trying to work with garment workers directly in order to launch Bhutan satellite locations or their own version of whatever, because we've learned so much. This work is incredibly, incredibly challenging. And especially the first year, last year, I would cry every single day, either from like laughing so much or just like from complete stress. So it has been quite the journey. And so, yeah, for us, it's really important that we're really able to share all of our knowledge, not try to hoard it, not try to be like, this is our private intellectual property, but how can we actually spread this idea and help people also grow in different ways within this vision. And also for Chicago, we're really excited because we have really exciting plans here. We're hoping to purchase some building. That was such a cute giggle. We're hoping to purchase a building here in Chicago within the next several months, and also be able to develop a little bit more of a hub within fashion, but also the ways, again, in which fashion intersects with different issues. So a lot of our members are domestic violence survivors, and they want to be able to build out housing for domestic violence survivors within our facility as well. So we're trying to build a larger facility that can house a bunch of different people and people who are creating and collaborating in different things. So we're really excited about the next phase for Blueton here in Chicago as well too. And we're also hiring. So immigrant, refugee, working class women out there who has extensive sewing experience. You slide in our DMs. Thank you.
Great. I think we're ready for the Q&A if you guys are ready for some questions from our audience here.
Ready.
Stephanie asks, what should consumers look for when choosing ethical fashion? How can you find out if something is produced ethically? That's the $1 million question, right?
I love that question. Abigail, you go first.
No, no, I'm interviewing you. No, please.
Well, this is no longer an interview, so I
stop. It is too. Come on.
Oh, I was serious.
Oh man. Okay. Well, I mean, it's that is a hard question. That is genuinely a difficult question, actually. Right. Which is, I think, why the two of us are fighting with each other about who's going to answer it. But I will say it first. That's a hard question. That's a hard question. I mean, I think and it is not an uncomplicated question. So I think this is kind of a goofy example that I'm going to give here, but I had a very long conversation with my sister not all that long ago about the merits of various types of underwear. She was trying to buy a decent pair of underwear and socks. She was like, what do I do?
I feel like you're always having conversations about underwear.
Yeah, I don't know where this does keep happening, actually. It's another project that I work on anyway. But she was like, do I get the one that is bamboo? Do I get the one that is hemp? Do I get the one that's organic cotton? Do I get the one that has been was stitched in Canada or whatever? And so she was having, she was faced with the conundrum that I think a lot of us are faced with when we're trying to do something within a system that is truly punishing, right? Which is, I think, kind of what we've been talking about all night. And we were speaking about it, and it's not that I don't actually know that most of us have the ability to decide whether or not bamboo is going to be better than organic cotton. They're both problematic, real talk. And so I think that the answer in some ways is actually just to buy less. And I think that frequently gets couched within sort of a neoliberal conversation around choice, that the idea of you go into Forever 21 and it's this paragon of choice. You can go in and you can express yourself in 52,000 different ways. But I what I think Hoda and I are both in agreement on is we're that there might be the more ethical choice might actually just be to buy less, and to buy something that you truly, and to buy for love, right? And which I feel like I'm getting a little woo-woo here, but genuinely to understand that clothing can also have a significance or meaning beyond just whether or not something looks well. And I think it should. I also think it should look well, right? I'm a fashion design professor. I love this. It needs to look good. But I think also that to where possible, to understand where your suppliers are or where things are coming from. So to sort of collapse the distance between the site of production and the site of consumption. And then where that's not possible, to buy better and buy less, which always feels like a slightly dissatisfying answer. But I think is currently the kind of the best one that I would give. Would you add to that, Hoda?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. And I definitely, I think this is a very challenging question that I agree that doesn't really have that much of an answer. Because I think it goes back to kind of what the conversation was about, is that even ethically made something something that's the garment workers are paid minimum wage in a certain country doesn't mean that that is still ethical. And a lot of things that are sustainable are not ethical. And something can have sustainable materials, but is not manufactured sustainably. And so I think what's really important is to also like recognize how different all of these terms are and how brands will consistently greenwash or like basically say that their things are so ethical and so fun, but are really made in a sweatshop or also made unsustainably. So like H&M's sustainable collection, for example, sure, maybe the the fabrics themselves could be sustainable, but the amount of product that they're producing, that is truly unsustainable. I spoke to garment workers and interviewed them in H&M's sustainable factory, and they were still sweatshops. And so I think that it's really important that we recognize that brands lie to you, the government lies to you, police lie to you, and brand lie to you all the time, the Holy Trinity. And so I think that's really important to recognize. And I think especially right now, as a side tangent to that, but on the topic of people lying to you, I think specifically right now, we're seeing a lot of like, so it's kind of like greenwashing, but like for the revolution in politics. It's like revolution washing is like the term that I always use, which is like putting people who look like me or like Black and brown people on brands like Nike, brands like H&M, and like, oh my God, they like have a hijabi model, so they must be so inclusive and they see me. But that doesn't matter because we're not trying to be seen by trillion-dollar corporations or like major transnational corporations that exploit people who look like me to make that clothes. And so I think it's very important that we recognize that these systems of violence are structural. And it's at the end of the day, I know that everyone's telling you otherwise because it's close to November 3rd, your individual choice only matters so much. And that's also the same with elections because we still have the Electoral College. But that being said, this has been a fun conversation. I think what's also really, really important is that, yes, like, so your choice is important because I think it says a lot about who you are and like how you choose to operate in the world. Because just like Abigail said, I think the most important thing to do is to really reframe and like change your relationship with consumption. We live in a world that is just like self-care is like buying things rather than like caring for the people around your community. We have very warped ways of care, very warped ways of like growth, or very warped ways of just like the ways in which we operate, that the things that we own and can like tangibly hold on to define who we are more than what we do or what we say. And so I think that's really important, is just to reframe our relationship to commodities and goods and things that we buy in a world, in a capitalist society that tells us otherwise. And I think that's really, really important, is to not find emotional support in buying things. I did that as a freshman in college the night before midterms. I'm guilty. I would like buy all the things I didn't need, but it was like emotional relief and like something that is like stress-free or whatever, stress releasing. And so I think I think it really comes down to like limiting purchasing. And something that I always give as an example, as a metaphor, is like thinking about your wardrobe as like an art gallery that you would curate. So like you're not buying a trillion paintings that you've hung up on your wall, but you're buying like 2 or 3 things, in my case 3, 3 things that say something about you. And maybe they're expensive, but you don't have that many. So you can spend the same amount of clothes that you would on fast fashion, but on local designers like Abigail, Jamie Hayes of Production Mode here in Chicago, who actually was instrumental in helping launch Blueton, as well as so many other amazing local fashion designers here in Chicago, supporting them, which were probably more expensive than your Forever 21, which I feel like we've really ratted on Forever 21.
Well, this kind of goes along, this sort of goes along with the next question that we have, which is, can you speak at all about the specific price points of items that you make and how they compare to fast fashion prices and how you kind of navigate that?
Yes. We're going to be more expensive. We can't like pretend that it's not going to be more expensive. But there are 2 things that I think are important in that. So we don't have like a set rate for things because everything depends on like the clothes itself. So it's not like a thing that you can just find out. But I think a lot of fast fashion is made to fall apart and made not to last intentionally. And so we don't make clothes in that manner because we take our time and we make it very like intentionally and deliberately. And then B, again, because we are paying everybody more and also providing things like mental health, healthcare, childcare, all of these things that really like make us feel like a community, things are going to be more expensive. But for us, I think this often turns into a conversation about that I think really is unfair about like why, which I think is real, is like ethical fashion is more expensive, but it turns into a conversation pitting poor Americans versus poor garment workers, rather than taking a step back and not asking why is this so expensive? Why can't garment workers just take their pay whenever they get it? But instead asking the question, why is the CEO of Nike one of the richest men on earth? Why are those profit margins so massive? And I think if we can, again, always step back and think about those systems, we can always direct our anger toward the right people and direct our questions toward the right institutions as well, too. So we're proud to be charging more than sweatshops because we're not trying to compete with sweatshops. And I think we should be asking more about why designers make massive profit margins while garment workers are being fired in mass and getting COVID.
That's great. Yeah. Riley asks, and this kind of goes along with what you were just saying about what you do at Bluetin. What steps does Bluetin production take to create a physical space that is comfortable and safe for its members?
Yeah, a lot of things. And I think it's something that's really challenging because even outside of living within a global pandemic. So something that I think is also really important to recognize is just because you're here now as a refugee does not mean that like you're safe, and does not mean that like your family is safe and that all of the trauma is like disappeared into the world. So I think a lot of the ways that we create a safe and like healthy space is just like the transparency and vulnerability and trust that we have with each other, that I think is so much easier to have within a space that is all women or gender non-conforming people and trans people, that like we are all kind of on the same page in terms of like trauma and love and understanding why those relationships are so important. But then also it's like consistently centering people and not profit, which is how we're always told to do the opposite in the world that we live in. So to give an example of something that actually happened last year, not uncommonly, is that we'd have a large client have a production due on Friday. And on Wednesday, for example, one of our members got a call that morning that her uncle and his 18-year-old son were suddenly killed in bombings in Damascus. And so in that situation, how are you supposed to operate? And I think these are the really challenging questions that we're trying to figure out as we go, and has been a learning process. So for us, for example, we stopped all of our production. We like went for a walk, we like had ice cream, we had lunch by the lake, and we didn't finish that production and we lost that client. And so like capitalism and the ways in which our world operates tells us one thing, but then we're trying to tell ourselves a different thing. And I think it's being able to strike that balance between like making sure that we're always centering people rather than what quote unquote makes sense for profit margins, and just pushing ourselves to be able to create that space even when it doesn't feel quote unquote logical, but actually feels right. And I think it's being able to unlearn all of like how we're told things should operate and really just thinking about what we want and then doing that.
That's great. Well, we're almost at time, but I have one more question we had come in that says, how can we help abolish fast fashion? Is it just personal choice, or are there laws or reforms proposed that people can support?
I love this question. Yes, there's so much that you can do. Aside from helping us, kidding, we're okay. But obviously donations are more than but I think something that's really, really important is recognizing, again, taking that step back, thinking about where money is going, where power is structured, and how, again, everything is interconnected. So I think something that when I went to Indonesia and met with garment workers there that was so, so beautiful and striking is that the garment worker that I spoke to was wearing an Angela Davis shirt. There is a Palestinian flag in the background. They were reading Paulo Freire. These like garment workers are incredible, and they are deeply, deeply in solidarity on a global level with everything that's happening. And I think that's something that here in the United States, we constantly fail, is global solidarity, and understanding how everything is so interconnected. Understanding how the fact that, again, factories exist and sweatshops exist abroad because of the ways that the US military is able to kind of really, really maintain US economic interests in countries like Indonesia, countries like Cambodia, Afghanistan. The ways in which US militarism is linked to the ability to maintain sweatshops, that's critical. The fact that sweatshops exist all across the United States within US prisons. There is no way that we will ever be able to get rid of all sweatshops and all of these violent working conditions if prisons still exist. And so I think just like we talked about ways in which our relationships to our clothes really need to change on an individual level, yes, but also our relationships need to change with all the other ways that fast fashion is sort of involved in different systems of violence. We can't reform fast fashion. We also can't reform prisons. We can't reform the police. And all these things are so deeply connected. So even if you're just out in the streets protesting policing, protesting prisons, protesting the US military and surveillance, this actually is part of supporting garment workers and ending fast fashion on a global scale, because we're able to take a step back and recognize how interconnected all of these things are, and that garment workers and fast fashion will always exist so long as the police exist, and always exist so long as the United States is a military. So I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Well, thank you both so much. This has been a great conversation and perfect to have during Slow Fashion Month. So important. So I want to thank Hoda and Abigail for being here. I also want to say special thanks to my colleague, Amanda Zagloba. Amanda runs the Makers on 8 program at Harold Washington Library Center, and she's been doing crafts virtually. So check out our website if you want to still connect with Amanda, even though you haven't seen her in person in a while. She helped to put tonight together. I want to mention a couple of upcoming events through One Book One Chicago. November 10th, we'll present Finding Home, an Indigenous Perspective on Land, Language, and Identity with Dr. Anton Troyer. And on December 3rd, we're going to have our season finale with the author of Exit West, Mohsen Hamid here. So please go to onebookonechicago.org for information on that and all kinds of other programming. Also, tonight's program is being recorded. And if you have a friend who missed it, you can send them the link right after. It'll be available on the YouTube channel and on the Facebook of CPL. Thanks so much for being here, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Have a good night.